Well, good morning or afternoon, and welcome to the first in a series of webinars about the Interstate Passport. I'm Kate Springsteen, the Project Coordinator of Member and Educational Services for the Interstate Passport. The Interstate Passport is a new framework for block transfer of lower division general education based on learning outcomes and transfer level proficiency. This webinar series is designed to tell you how the Passport framework was created, by whom, and how it works. Over the next year, we'll have webinars for specific audiences such as faculty, registrars, institutional researchers, academic advisors, administrators, and others at participating institutions, as well as for those at institutions interested in becoming part of the Interstate Passport Network. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Passport website by June 23rd at the latest. If you have questions throughout the presentation, type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar dashboard, and your question will be brought to the presenter's attention. Following this webinar, I will send out an email with a survey link. Please fill this out, as we really appreciate any and all feedback on our presentations and on the Interstate Passport more generally. I am delighted to introduce you to Dr. Robert Turner, who has led the work of faculty from multiple institutions and states in the development of the Passport learning outcomes and proficiency criteria since the project's inception as a grassroots initiative in 2011. Bob is retired from the Oregon University system, where he served as the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Academic Strategies after a long career as a biology professor at Western Oregon University. Welcome, Bob.
About the passport, and as Kate mentioned, this is a new transfer framework and it's based on learning outcomes. During today's presentation, I will be talking about the origin, goal, and design of the passport. I will spend most of my time talking about the components of the passport and the way the passport operates. I'll also briefly outline the phases in the development of the passport, make some comments about quality assurance in the passport, and make some points about the benefits of the passport to students, institutions, and systems, and finally outline very briefly the method that can be used to join the passport. Well, as you may know, WICHE is one of a handful of regional commissions that were established by the National Congress in order to facilitate higher education in different areas in the country. WICHE holds several meetings a year, and at one of these meetings, a meeting of the two-year academic leaders, the question was asked, is there not something that can be done about credit loss and adding credits to students after they transfer? There's some reality behind this question. This map shows in color code the percentage of bachelor degree awardees in each of the states that have earned credits in other states. And as you can see, the average across the country is that 20% of people who receive bachelor's degrees have earned credits in other states. So transfer across state lines is something that is not infrequent. This credit loss is a real issue. Atwell and Monahan in 2015 published an article in which they found that only 58% of transfer students are able to bring 90% or more of their credits with them when they transfer. They further found that only about 14% of transfer students actually lose more than 90% of their credits. And that means that the remaining 28% of the transfer students lose between 10 and 89% of their credits. These numbers are not of small consequence to the transfer student. Transfer students, on average, take 1.2 years, which costs them an initial $9,000 on average before they receive their degrees, relative to students who do not transfer. So a response has been mounted to that question, and that response is the Interstate Passport. As Kate pointed out in her opening remarks, the passport is a grassroots effort. It originated with that question that was asked by an academic leader, and it has been formulated to advance friction-free transfer for students in the region. The passport, as I will illustrate, as I will show you, describe to you, has been designed by faculty, by registrars, by institutional researchers, and by advisors. It has been rolled out in 3 phases over about a 5-year span, and participation in developing and enlisting in the passport is entirely voluntary for all of these phases. The goal of the transport can be very, very simply stated. It is to reduce unnecessary repetition of academic work after students transfer. In working toward this goal, the Passport Initiative is keeping a focus on ensuring quality. The single most important word on this slide, and I would contend in this presentation, is the word students. The passport is aimed at students. It is aimed at improving graduation rates of students. It is aimed at shortening their time to degree, and it is aimed at saving them money. And as we all know, student loan debt is an astronomical problem in the United States. When putting together the Interstate Passport, several design decisions were made. The first, based on the fact that the passport is interstate, is that the passport ought to address an academic program that is found across many states. And this program, the single program that is most ubiquitous, is general education. In designing the passport, we considered basing the passport on course-to-course interstate transfer agreements. One of the people who worked with us on that pointed out that using course-to-course transfer agreements would look like an airline route map. It's extremely complicated with many nodes and many connections. So we settled on using learning outcomes as the focus for the passport, and this provides the opportunity for cross-border match that is the most straightforward. In designing the passport, we have consistently operated on using a couple of major principles. The first is that institutions are individual. The faculty at institutions own the curriculum, and that curriculum is the way that students would be brought to proficiency with learning outcomes. So we honor institutional individuality in each step of the passport. The second is something that is pretty basic, and that is that any effort like this is not going to be sustainable unless it is designed by the individuals who will be operationalizing and implementing the effort. So faculty, researchers, faculty, registrars, institutional researchers, academic advisors are the people that have designed the passport. So again, emphasis on students, institutional individuality, and design by the people that are making the work, by doing the work on the ground. So let's look at the components in the operation of the passport. The first component of the passport is that it is it covers general education. And general education, both from the LEAP Essential Learning Outcomes and from a study conducted by WICHE staff, general education commonly has within it a number of academic knowledge and skill areas. So that's the first piece of the passport, is 9 academic and skill areas. The second is that for each of these areas there is a set of passport learning outcomes. These have been developed and written by faculty. Each of these passport learning outcomes has examples of ways that faculty bring students to proficiency with the learning outcomes. These we call proficiency criteria. They have also been written and assembled by faculty. Faculty are also responsible at each institution for putting together a passport block of learning experiences that address all of the PLOs. So these have been developed by faculty. As we'll see, there also is a tracking system that's part of the passport that keeps track of academic progress of students after they transfer. This piece has been designed by registrars and institutional researchers. Formally, in order for an institution to become part of the passport, there is an application and a memorandum of understanding that needs to be signed. And finally, there is a passport review board. This is the body that will keep track of the operation of the Passport initiative. It will meet on an annual basis, and it consists of a Passport state facilitator from each of the states in which there are Passport institutions. So let's now look at these, the first 5 of these components of the Passport. The first is the As I said earlier, the Passport has been rolled out in several stages. The funding has come from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Lumina Foundation, and currently a First in the World grant from the Department of Education, and that funding runs through 2019. So the first component of the Passport is the lower division general education areas that are being addressed. During phase 1, the first couple of years in which the Passport process was piloted, we addressed the foundational skills of oral communication, written communication, and quantitative literacy. Since the conclusion of that first 2 years of the pilot study, we have added 4 knowledge and skill areas: natural sciences, human cultures, human society and the individual, and creative expression. And because this did not make our plate full and rich enough, we also decided that we ought to address cross-cutting skill areas of critical thinking, teamwork, and value systems. So that's the first component of the Passport, 9 general education areas. The second component is a set of Passport learning outcomes for each of these areas. Here we see an example or an illustration of those learning outcomes for critical thinking. And these Passport learning outcomes are acceptable to every institution that signs on to the Passport. They are not the institutional learning outcomes, but they are acceptable to Passport institutions as a currency that a student carries from one institution to another. For critical thinking, there are several steps. The faculty has decided that students should be able to identify a problem or question, recognize assumptions, identify and gather information, evaluate the information, identify context, and develop logical conclusions. And there are a set of learning outcomes, again, for each of the 9 lower division GE areas that are addressed by the Passport. The third component of the Passport is a set of transfer level proficiency criteria. These are illustrations, examples of ways that faculty are currently having students demonstrate that the student is proficient with the Passport learning outcomes. These are examples and not requirements. The student, and as you can see, for problem setting in the critical thinking area, there are 3 different Passport proficiency criteria listed. One of them is that a student may be able to identify decisions that a corporation might make about producing snack foods made with trans fats, and so demonstrate their ability to identify a problem and to break it down in its component parts. Well, I think it's useful now to take a look at the differences, a comparison between the proficiency criteria and the learning outcomes. The learning outcomes, simply stated, are statements of what students must know and be able to do in order to attain lower division education GE proficiency. For example, problem setting. We've already seen this learning outcome. Identify a problem or question and its component parts. And this is the piece of the Passport that is held in common across all institutions. All institutions that sign on to the Passport agree to this as a transfer learning outcome in critical thinking. The transfer level proficiency criteria are simply statements of one assignment that is currently being used somewhere by a faculty member for students to show that they're proficient with the PLO. And in this case, as I cited previously, a specific assignment is that a student may be called upon to identify a set of decisions that a corporation might make. So the learning outcomes are held in common across all Passport institutions. The proficiency criteria are illustrations of institution-specific ways that students can be brought to proficiency. These PLOs and PC were developed for each of the knowledge and skill areas in the following way. And first, within a state, 2- and 4-year faculty teams specific for each of the 9 areas came together to agree on an intra-state set of learning outcomes. And as we'll see, there were initially 7 states involved in this process. The next step is that the teams from each state came together in an interstate negotiation session. At this meeting, the faculty representatives from each of the states came together face-to-face, got to know each other, and negotiated a consensus first draft set of interstate PLOs and PCs. The next step is that the representatives dispersed from that negotiation meeting, went back to their states, talked with their faculty peers, and obtained feedback from their faculty peers on those draft PLOs and PCs. Then that was then followed by a series of several conference calls, and during those conference calls the faculty representatives from all of the states got together, used the results of the vetting process within each of their states to arrive at and to negotiate a final set of passport learning outcomes and PCs. And I'll come back to this point again, but I would like to emphasize that this process for all 18 of these meetings, that is 9 sets of PLOs, 9 sets of PCs, this process was concluded in late spring of 2016. And finally, the Passport Review Boards I mentioned before, composed of the passport state facilitators from each state, is going to meet annually, and one of their tasks will be to monitor feedback that they would get from their states on the effectiveness, the efficacy of the passport, and if needed, decide whether or not there needs to be some modification to elements of the passport, including the learning outcomes and possibly the PCs. So now we have a set of passport learning outcomes, we have a set of proficiency criteria. So what comes next? The next thing is that each institution's faculty, individually, unique to institution, puts together a passport block. The passport block has to address the learning outcomes that are in the passport. The passport block is an institution-specific set of courses or other learning opportunities that faculty at that institution use to address the PLOs. And one of the ways that I've started visualizing the passport block is as a cardboard box. So we have a box, and written on the outside of that cardboard box is passport block. The passport block cardboard box contains 9 paper bags, 1 paper bag for each of the knowledge and skill areas. Each paper bag has written on the outside of it the learning outcomes for that particular skill, knowledge or skill areas. So at this point, the cardboard box and the paper bags within it are the same at every passport institution. However, when the passport block is constructed, faculty at each institution decide what they are going to use at their institution to bring students to proficiency with the PLOs in each of these 9 areas. So the red institution uses learning opportunities indicated by the red and blue areas. The blue institution has their own set of arrows. Some of those may be overlap or be identical to the red institution, some may not. But the identity between institutions is totally fortuitous because each institution's faculty is deciding how they are going to fill the paper bags that are in their cardboard box. Then when a student completes the passport block at a particular institution, boom, the top of the box is closed, sealed, the student picks it up and carries that box to the receiving institution, to the institution to which they're transferring. That receiving institution has its own passport block. It's not going to open up the block that is being carried by the student to them, and it's not going to reopen the box that is its passport block. It is going to say to the student, you do not have to do any of the academic work that is in our passport block in order to complete your lower division general education. Well, let's now take a look at a couple illustrations of passport blocks. One of them from Laramie County Community College is on the screen now. You can see that this is an excerpt that doesn't cover all 9 of the areas. You can see that for oral communication and for written communication, there is one course in each area that the student must take in order to become a passport student. For quantitative literacy, there are a number of different selections that the student may make. Some of those selections involve taking 2 courses, Statistics Statway 1 and 2. Some of them involve taking a single course, Introductory Stats for the Social Sciences. Similarly, for human cultures, the knowledge area for Laramie Community College, there are a number of choices that the student can make. If we look at another set of institutions in the same system, Leeward Community College in Hawaii has 3 selections the student could make in order to become proficient in the written oral communication area. The University of Hawaii at West Oahu is said to the student, if you're going to become proficient with oral communication at our institution, there's one course you must take. So I hope these examples pull out the fact that while the learning outcomes are the same for every institution that decides to join the passport, those learning outcomes, number one, are not the institution's learning outcomes. They are a currency that the student can use to move from institution to institution. And secondly, that the passport blocks are uniquely defined by the faculty at each individual institution. So the Interstate Passport is actually an interstate articulation agreement. It uses learning outcomes to expedite transfer by students among institutions. It's not a replacement for the general education program at an institution, and it's not a replacement for internal state transfer initiatives. It may prove to be a useful tool for efficient transfer within a state. And parenthetically, I would add that exposure to the Interstate Passport Initiative and its process has led some institutions and systems to begin to reinvestigate their general education. Well, it should be clear from these points that I've made that there is a strong element of trust involved in the passport. Every passport institution has to trust that the passport block at one institution, it conveys the same proficiency with the same learning outcomes at a second institution, and that those learning outcomes do not need to be repeated. That coursework does not need to be repeated in order for the student to become a successful graduate at the new institution. The passport also contains, in addition to this element of trust, a tracking system, a system that monitors the progress of passport students after they transfer. So this is another component, the final component of the passport that I'll be addressing. It has been developed by registrars and institutional researchers, and it actually has been conducted in each of the first 2 years of the passport on a pilot basis. There are 2 components to the academic progress tracking mechanism. The first is what we refer to as Passport Verify. Every passport institution awards a passport. The registrars have decided that every passport institution ought to note that passport on the student's transcript. And the National Student Clearinghouse is going to be taking on the process of keeping track of passport students, tracking and recording their grades. So each institution is going to send the National Student Clearinghouse on a term basis a list of their new passport students, just as they now send a list of their new graduates. So NSC already has a degree verify system. This is a modification of that system that is Passport Verify. And this will be automated by NSC in November of 2016. The second component of the academic progress tracking piece is, again, developed by registrars and institutional researchers. In this component, grades will be submitted to the National Student Clearinghouse by every receiving institution. those grades for transfer students, passport and non-passport, for the first 2 terms after the student's transfer. Grades will also be submitted for students that are native to that institution and have earned a passport for the 2 terms after they earn the passport. Once a year, the National Student Clearinghouse will put together an academic progress tracking report that will be individualized to each sending institution. Each sending institution will then learn how well their students, all of their transfer students, performed at every receiving institution relative to native students at the receiving institution that have earned a passport. Those academic progress tracking reports are also going to be sent to the Passport Review Board. This will allow the Passport Review Board to have a means of continuously evaluating the Passport Initiative for its efficiency and effectiveness. By spring of 2017, the National Student Clearinghouse will have automated not just Passport Verify, but also the academic progress tracking reports. So, we have now gone through, or I have gone through, and you with me, the components and the operation of the passport. Let's now briefly look at several other topics, the first of which is the phases of passport development. As I mentioned earlier, there have been several phases. There were 7 states involved in developing the passport learning outcomes, the proficiency criteria, the tracking system, and I would add that the tracking system has been conducted successfully manually by the institutions in these the participating institutions in these 7 states. These states are Hawaii, North Dakota, Oregon, South Dakota, Utah, Wyoming, and California. During the second phase of the passport, an additional 6 states have joined. Now that the passport learning outcomes and proficiency criteria are put together at the end of spring term 2016, these states are going to test the process of using that completed passport to construct their own passport blocks. They're piloting and testing the construction of the passport blocks. These states are Arkansas, Idaho, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, and Virginia. A third group of states are doing a pilot of mapping faculty assignments back to the passport learning outcomes. So these faculty at 2 institutions, a 2-year and a 4-year in each of these states, Colorado, Montana, New Mexico, are taking selected assignments and saying these assignments address the passport learning outcomes for this particular area. The fit of those assignments to the particular PLOs will be evaluated internally and also by the faculty with expertise in that subject area at the other 5 institutions and by NCHEMS in a process that will be led by Peter Ewell. So this mapping study will look at the actual relationship of the assignments and also student artifacts to the passport learning outcomes.
Hey Bob, this is Kate, and I have a question from the audience. What 2-year institutions are part of the mapping project?
The 2-year institutions are Santa Fe Community College, Ames Community College in Santa Fe in New Mexico, Ames in Colorado, and Great Falls Community College in Montana. So, thanks for the question. Moving on to the next piece of the conversation, an important part of the phases of the development of the passport is the timeline. As I mentioned several times, the learning outcomes proficiency criteria were just finalized in the spring of 2016. So this spring and this summer, faculty at participating institutions are putting together their institution unique passport block. It's necessary, as we'll see later on, for the institutions to have complete passport blocks before they can apply to join the passport. So the first time that the institutions can apply is July 1st of 2016. That means, of course, that the first passports will be earned by students at the end of the fall term of 2016, and that will also be the time at which passport institutions will be able to first report passport verified to the National Student Clearinghouse. Then the spring of 2017 obviously is the first term that passport students will be able to transfer, and that means that it's also the first term at which institutions will be able to first report their academic progress data to the National Student Clearinghouse. The end of fall 2017 will be the first time that passport students' grades for the second term after transfer will be available. So there is first a time for institutions to join the passport that starts July 1st, 2016. The decision has been made on that for a limited time. The first 100 passport institutions will be able to join the passport for free, no cost. And I would mention just that the cost of the passport on an annual basis approximates the cost of the savings that are accrued by recruiting or retaining one additional student. So moving on to the next piece of the conversation, what assurance do we have that there is quality embedded in the passport? Well, the first piece is that every passport student must earn a minimum grade of C, not in the entire passport block on average, but in each component of the passport. So every course or learning opportunity that the student completes must be completed at the C level or better. The second, which I've already mentioned, is the academic progress tracking. It'll be automated and conducted by NSC, and that will give an opportunity to assure that students with passports have in fact experienced learning at their sending institution that enables them to succeed at the receiving institution. Another piece of quality assurance is the pilot study, the mapping, that is looking at the relationship between critical assignments and the passport learning outcomes and the students' artifacts that are generated by those assignments. A piece that I haven't yet mentioned, which is included in the First in the World grant, is that there will be a major research study of the impact of the passport. This research study is going to go far beyond the academic progress tracking piece of the passport. It's going to look at grades. It'll include the progress tracking. It's also going to look at top progress to degree in terms of time, terms, number of credits, cost to students. It will be conducting surveys and focus groups that involve students, faculty registrars, advisors. So it is a very real research study that will look at the impact of the passport, including that quality piece. And finally, the Passport Review Board, as I mentioned, will be meeting on an annual basis, monitoring the efficacy of the passport, making sure that the passport provides students with the background they need to succeed and successfully carry through on their academic program. Well, I mentioned a little bit ago that the passport is an articulation agreement. So let's just take a minute and look at and relate typical articulation agreements to the Interstate Passport. A typical articulation agreement is designed to make transfer easy. The passport is designed to make transfer successful because the goal of the passport is that there is no repetition or additional academic work that has to be included in order for the student to have completed the components of the lower division GE. Second piece is that the articulation agreements typically count courses and credits. The passport is based on faculty consensus learning outcomes, not on courses and credits. The fact that our typical articulation agreements based on courses means that it's necessary to trust that the course syllabi from different articulation partners mean that the courses are equivalent. There's a trust piece in the passport also. It trusts that the passport learning outcomes has been attained no matter what course or learning experience the passport student has been put through, has been attained. Another piece to articulation agreements is that if an articulation partner decides they want to change their program or change some of their transferable courses, all of their other articulation partners now need to conduct a detailed study of the syllabi of those transferable courses. Because each institution puts into their passport block the courses that they use at their institution to impart proficiency, and because the passport block cardboard box is then sealed, there is no need to examine transferable course changes on the part of any of the passport articulation partners. It's the proficiency with the learning outcomes that it matters, that is being carried from one institution to the next. The way each institution brings the student to proficiency is up to the institution's faculty, and changes in those ways, those courses, do not need to be examined by any of the other passport partners. Typical articulation agreements finally assume that students are successful at the new school. Well, they assume that also that they've transferred successfully. The Interstate Passport does not make that assumption. The Interstate Passport tracks the actual progress of students after they've transferred and shares that progress data among the passport network. So finally, having said all that, let's look at some of the benefits of the passport to students, to institutions, and to states. Benefits to the students. To the students, the passport will decrease repetition of academic work. An important component of this is that the student then has the sense that they've achieved a milestone. And there is research data that says that when a student achieves a milestone, or those students that achieve milestones, AA degrees for example, complete their academic career more frequently, with greater frequency than students who do not. And one particular reason that has been given for this is that just completing a milestone says to the student internally, you know, I nailed that, I can do that, I'm ready to step on to the next step. It increases the student's motivation to completion. Another advantage to the student, of course, is that less time to degree means lower cost. Their cost of their education is less. And when the cost of their education is less, they have less debt, and their earnings after they graduate, after they complete their academic career, are impacted less by student debt. They have lower foregone earnings. For institutions, the passport improves performance metrics. It increases completers, that is, this is now a milestone. A completion of the passport is a milestone that ought to and should be credited to both the sending and the receiving institutions. We have brought our students to completion of this particular piece of their academic work. That performance metric counts. A second point, which I just made in the previous slide when we compared articulation agreements to the passport, is that there's no need for course-to-course general education articulation. Less resource has to be devoted to going through syllabi to look at articulation courses. And of course, one outcome of that is that it's easier to maintain a state's transfer and articulation websites. Some benefits of the passport to institutions. One comes from mapping to the passport learning outcomes. Since the passport learning outcomes are the common piece that is among the passport institutions, any curriculum that the faculty at any passport institution says maps to the learning outcomes is valid, and that increases. It doesn't decrease, it increases curricular flexibility and innovation that can be exercised by faculty at the individual institutions. It also, of course, again, reduces the articulation renegotiation that should be undergone as courses and disciplines evolve. And eliminates, I made this point several times, you don't need to look at the course-by-course transfer any longer with your new partners. For institutions and states, there is a very distinct advantage to the passport. The Passport generates student success tracking data, so that tracking data can be on part of Passport students and non-Passport transfer students, can be used to monitor academic progress and academic performance. And that data can be used in a couple of ways. One, as to advertise the effectiveness of the institution, and the other is as a source of internal review. If the institution sees something that they would like that is less than they would like it to be, they have some data upon which to base any changes they might wish to make. So, and that tracking data involves persistence, it involves number of completers, and it involves time to degree. So why should an institution become a Passport institution? Well, in the first place, obviously it facilitates transfer across state lines, and it can, if adopted within a state, it can facilitate transfer within states. It removes a major obstacle to transfer student success. It eliminates the need for review of lower division GE course changes in articulation agreements. The Passport, why become a Passport institution? It focuses on quality that has a positive impact on completion. The learning outcomes are based on what students should learn and be able to apply. It generates data on academic success after transfer, and it provides data for use in continuous self-improvement. Additional reasons to become a Passport institution. The Passport is easily adapted to the changing landscape of higher education. It can embrace unique assessments that are determined by each department, program, or institution. It can include non-course-based educational experiences. And all of these are part of the way that higher education is changing in this country right now. And finally, the authority to issue an interstate passport is a positive for the institution. It recognizes student achievement, and it can be used as a recruiting tool. So we now are at the last of the 5 major points, or I guess 6 major points actually, that I wish to make during this presentation, and that is join us. Join the Passport network. The first step that needs to be taken to join is quite straightforward. Faculty simply need to look at the Passport learning outcomes and decide whether these Passport learning outcomes are congruent with, consistent with, not in conflict with our own institutional, departmental, or programmatic learning outcomes for general education. Again, the Passport learning outcomes do not have to be adopted by the institution, but they need to be consistent with the learning outcomes that the institution may have. The next step is for the faculty to use those learning outcomes to construct the institution's Passport block. Once that has been accomplished, the institutional administration needs to apply for Passport status and to sign the Memorandum of Understanding. At that point, the institution is now a Passport institution, and their advisors, the marketers at the institution, have an obligation to inform students of the Passport and to advise them how to complete the Passport. The registrars and institutional researchers, the registrars need to make sure that the Passports are being awarded. Institutional researchers need to make sure that they track the academic progress of their Passport students. So I want to thank you for attending this webinar, and I am going to close with a couple of slides. One that points out that there are a wealth of resources available for anybody who is interested in the Passport at the Passport website at www.witche.edu/passport. Included among these are the 3 that are listed here: a handbook for faculty, a handbook for registrars and institutional researchers, a handbook for advisors, and there's a lot of background information about the Passport on the website. And we encourage you to contact us. Pat Shea is the Director of Academic Leadership Initiatives at WICHE. Jane Sherman is the Passport Tri-Region Coordinator. She's the individual who is coordinating the work of the states that are constructing their passport blocks. And I have served as the Passport State Coordinator for the states involved in the development of the passport, the first phase of the passport, and I will be continuing along with Kate Springsteen to coordinate the work of the institutions in the mapping pilot study. So at this point, I would like to turn the conversation back, or the webinar back over to Kate Springsteen, our organizer. And again, thank you very much for your attention, and ask you please to fill out the survey so that we can benefit from this webinar in addition to the benefits that you may have accrued. We need to have your feedback in order to do that. Thank you very much, and here is Kate.
Well, thanks, Bob, for your presentation, and we'll now be taking any questions that weren't answered throughout the presentation. If you do have a question, open up the Questions tab located on the webinar panel. If for any reason you do not see the Questions panel, it's probably hidden in the View tab at the very top of your screen. So while we are waiting for some questions to come in, I just have a few reminders. First, the next webinar in this series is titled The Interstate Passport, an Overview for Registrars and Institutional Researchers, and is scheduled for July 27th at 12 p.m. Mountain. The link to register for this webinar will be posted to the Passport website, which can be reached at www.wiche.edu/passport. The second reminder is what Bob just said, is about the survey. After this webinar, I'll be sending out an email with a link to the survey. The survey should only take about 5 minutes to complete, and we would very much appreciate it if you would do so. So with that, I'm going to turn myself on mute for a few seconds and to go through any potential questions. All right, Bob, we have a question on how is the passport integrating with work around guided pathways?
Thanks very much for the question, and that's one that has come up with some regularity. We have had sporadic and very informal conversations about the interaction or the interface between the passport and guided pathways. It seems to us that the passport process is a very useful one in putting together guided pathways in the first place. In the second place, that it is possible for the passport to be, for different passports to be constructed that might serve as guided pathways. The Laramie County Community College has actually put together a couple of passports, one specific that will serve as a guided pathway for, I believe it was secondary education, and the way they did so is that they restricted the course offerings in particular areas that satisfied that passport to courses that are specific for preparation for entry into a secondary education program. So they've basically taken the passport block, the passport learning outcomes, and in some of those learning outcomes they have told the student, they have put into the paper bag courses that only address the secondary education degree that the student might be aspiring to achieve. So while we have not made it a direct effort to link the passport to pathways at this time, the passport clearly has been adapted to that purpose by at least one institution, and as I said, I think that the process of putting together and developing the passport is one that is certainly amenable to putting together guided pathways. And it's possible that that may come. And one of our faculty teams that was putting together the learning outcomes actually wanted the Passport project to start developing a guided pathway in science. So while the connection hasn't been made tightly and overtly, the ability to adapt the Passport to guided pathways is certainly there. Thanks again for the question.
Another question, Bob. The question is, there are differences in the vocabulary that various learning initiatives, such as the DQP, use to describe key proficiencies. Is the Passport initiative trying to pull together and integrate this vocabulary so we can come closer to using the same language in our reform efforts?
That is an admirable goal, and certainly one that is worth achieving. I'd ask you to remember that the Passport is a response to a very specific question that has to do with transfer in the first place, and in the second place that in working on the Passport has occupied our time and energy. We're certainly aware of the DQP and of the the Venn diagrams that one might use to describe the DQP language and the language of the Passport. And it's desirable that down the road an effort be made to bring these together. But I remind you again that the Passport as an intact entity only came together, only was completed in this spring. So while we are aware of the DQP and we understand the language differences, our efforts have not been directed in that direction yet. They're certainly open to it, though. Thanks again for the question.
Another question related, what is the relationship to the LEAP outcomes?
Well, the LEAP essential learning outcomes on the AAC&U literature are really very brief statements, but they indicate areas in general education that are extremely important for students to become acquainted with and proficient with. We use the LEAP essential learning outcomes as a basis for asking the faculty to develop, as a basis for deciding on the areas in lower division GE that were going to be addressed by the Passport. The Passport learning outcomes are statements that go beyond the simple statements that are in the LEAP essential learning outcomes, but they certainly do not involve as much detail as the statements that might be found in AAC&U's value rubrics. So the ELOs were a basis for deciding on the general education outcomes for the Passport, and the Passport learning outcome statements are statements from faculty in those areas about what students should know and be able to do.
Okay, another question. What is the expected cost for institutions that want to join?
Well, the anticipated cost is, as I've kind of slid by in my comment, what is anticipated to be about equivalent to the savings that an institution would accrue in retaining and recruiting a single student. So the cost is not going to be exorbitant. It will be minimal. I should point out that the National Student Clearinghouse, their piece of the work is being done at no additional cost to institutions that are currently enrolled in NSC's Student Tracker. Thanks again. Thanks for that question too.
Okay, do students need to satisfy all 9 outcomes? What happens with respect to transferability if a student only satisfies some of the 9?
Well, I would ask you to go back and think in terms of the cardboard box. every institution's cardboard box has to have the 9 paper bags in it, and then the 9 paper bags with the same learning outcomes written on the outside of them, and only after the 9 bags have been completed can the box be sealed. So there is no provision made for a partial passport, and this is something that has been a topic of conversation since 2011 when we first started thinking about putting the passport together. So your question is a good one, and one that we've had to make a decision on. Thank you. Are there other questions, Kate?
I do not have any further questions right now, so maybe just give people one more minute.
And I would call your attention to the chat entry that Shay made that gives the URL for the cost of participating, and I will read that off to you. It's at the Passport website, which is www.witchy.edu/passport/membership. Thanks very much, Pat.
And Bob, we have another question. How do we address perceived lower division deficiencies, i.e. physical science experience but not life science experience, when requiring both physical and life science experiences at the upper division gen ed level if we don't look into the sealed box? How do we ensure competence for upper division if we don't critically evaluate the lower division experiences?
Well, there are really two answers to that question. Number one, there are 3 answers really. The first is that the passport is intended to fulfill lower division general education requirements. So the passport is not intended to be entry into a particular degree program. In that context of general education, the passport science team has as one of the learning outcomes that a student should be acquainted with both the physical and the biological sciences at the lower division general education level. Now, if a passport student comes into your institution and they intend to be or wish to be a biology major, then of course it's necessary they would receive credits for the passport block at your institution. But you are entitled to open the box and see whether or not, for purposes of that major, the student has the proper lower division courses. So the passport student needs to be given credit for the work that they've done in general education, but the passport is not intended to be entry into particular degree programs. Again, a question that is very valid, very legitimate, and has come up several times before. Thank you.
All right, we don't have any questions right now, Bob, but I'm going to give people just another minute in case any more come up from that answer.
Okay, good. Quiet minutes pass very slowly.
All right, so if we don't have any more questions, we hope you have enjoyed today's webinar and come back again on July 27th. If you do come up with some more questions in the meantime, please feel free to contact us, and you can also check out our website at www.wichita.edu/passport. We thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you have a great day.